I'm Steve Hermitage. Now in this video we'll take a look at a couple of the shots that I took on holiday in South Devon this year in the UK. Now on holiday there's really nothing wrong with a point and shoot camera and using your camera on completely automatic mode, but if you stop for a moment and just think about the available light that you have, you can achieve some far better shots. Now of course there are three important variables to consider when selecting the right camera settings before making an exposure, and of course those things are the ISO, the sensitivity of the sensor, the aperture, that's the size of the opening in the lens that lets the light through onto the camera sensor, and then of course there's the shutter speed, the amount of time that the shutter is open, allowing the light to pass through. Now you have to also select the right white balance setting on your camera so you make sure that you don't have a colour cast on your images. And then there's a setting that you may not play with quite frequently, and that is called the metering mode. Now the metering mode is a setting on the camera that you choose to allow the camera to work out and indicate to you the best combination of ISO, shutter speed and aperture. And there are a variety of metering modes that are available to you on your camera that give you the best chance of exposure. Let's run through what those three metering modes, or the three most common metering modes, are.
Okay, the first one is multi-zone metering. Now that's the best all-rounder choice. The image is divided into a series of zones by the camera's computer wizardry, and then a meter reading is determined for each of the zones. Your camera then uses each of those readings to work out a final exposure. And you'll see this mode referred to as matrix metering on the Nikon system, evaluative metering on the Canon system, or multi-segment metering on the Pentax system. Now the number of zones varies with the camera make and model. If you want the camera though to work out a more specific exposure or a certain area of the shot to ensure that that part of the shot is correctly exposed, then you can use a different type of metering, and that's called spot or partial metering. Now this is effective if there are large areas of either dark or light, maybe a snowy scene or a scene with highlights. And in partial metering modes, approximately 8% of the central viewfinder area is used in that to make up that exposure. In spot metering, the metering is again weighted at the central area, but only covers about 3% of the image in the central viewfinder. A third option is to use centre weighted average metering modes, and an average meter reading is generated that takes into account the light readings across the entire frame, but places an emphasis on the reading taken from the central viewfinder area. So for this shot I've used evaluative metering. I'm on aperture priority and I get an exposure of ISO 100, 1/125th of a second at f11. Now here's another setting to play with. It's the exposure bias. You can go -1 stop in aperture priority and my aperture remains at f11, but the shutter speed is then halved to 1/250th of a second, and going the other way I can overexpose by 1 stop, and now I'm at a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. That's a slower shutter speed that allows more light into the camera. 3 shots, all of which look pretty interesting, but the shot really could do with something else, and I think that's fill in flash. Now I'm going to use a Canon 580 EX speedlight mounted on the top of my camera, but before we get into fill in flash, let's just have a quick review of how your shutter works.
Now without getting too technical about how the shutter system works in your camera, we can just consider the fact that there are essentially 2 curtains that form part of the shutter system. Now at shutter speeds up to around 1/200th, 1/250th of a second, this is how it works. The first curtain opens, the sensor is then fully exposed and the exposure is made, then the second curtain shuts, covering up the sensor so it's no longer exposed to light. And that's it. That's essentially job done. First one opens, make the exposure, second one shuts. But to achieve apparent higher shutter speeds, what happens is this, that the first curtain begins to open and then the second curtain begins to shut at the same time as this first curtain is travelling across the sensor. So what you end up with is essentially a narrow band that moves across the sensor. So only a fraction of the sensor is exposed to light at any one point in time, and that's how you get high, or apparently high, shutter speeds. Now when we consider flash photography in its most simple form, there is a single burst of flash light. Now in that case the shutter needs to be fully open so that the sensor is fully exposed at that point when the flash light is made. In other words, the shutter speed needs to be slow enough to allow the exposure to synchronise with that single burst of flash light, and this is called slow sync flash. Now for those higher shutter speeds where you've got that band moving across the sensor and the sensor is only partially exposed to light at any one point in time, there needs to be multiple flashes of light to make that type of flash exposure, and that is called high speed sync flash. Now you'll need to read your manual, your camera manual and your flash manual to see how that works for your particular speed light and your camera system. Now when you use flash, the camera needs to work out how much power to deliver to the flash unit so that the subject is correctly exposed. Now you can go manual with all of the flash settings, but to keep things simple, let's just consider this evaluative through the lens metering, ETTL, that's used on the Canon system, ITTL on the Nikon system. Now at slow sync speeds, when you press the shutter down, the camera fires a pre-flash of light with the shutter closed. Now the camera can work out, it knows how much light was fired, and then it knows how much light was then sensed by the camera, and it also knows the distance of the subject to the camera, and it can use all of that data to actually work out then the correct power to send to the flash unit to make the correct exposure to illuminate the subject. And then in a split second after it's done that pre-flash and it's worked out that correct power, the shutter then opens, that second burst of flash light is made, the subject is illuminated, the exposure is made, and then the shutter curtains, the second curtain shuts again and the exposure is fully made. Now if you assume that your subject is completely in the dark, then it doesn't actually matter if the shutter is open for a second or it's open for 1/100th of a second. The power to the flashlight is exactly the same, so the shutter then won't impact the exposure. But that isn't really how things work in reality. Shots aren't often in complete darkness. There's going to be a mixture of ambient light and flashlight. So it then matters if the shutter is open either for 1 second or 1/100th of a second, because the ambient light will have an impact on the exposure. So in flash photography then, and using speed lights, you're concerned with two exposures: the ambient light exposure and the flashlight exposure.
Here we go then, let's look at this example again of my son on the beach. With ETTL metering, I've added a speed light to the top of my camera and I've made another exposure, and I think the image looks much better now. My sun is now less of a silhouette and the flash has been used here as a fill in light. Maybe the image straight out of the camera is a little bit flat, so I can tweak the levels in Photoshop, and here's the final image. Okay, so let's take a look at a second example. This is a boat on a very calm sea, and the time of day, it's kind of heading towards late evening. Now I'm on aperture priority mode again with evaluative metering on the camera, and we get an exposure of f16 at ISO 400th and 1/100th of a second. And you can see the top of the image, the sky is pretty overexposed, it's washed out, and there's really no detail in the clouds. And when you look at the foreground, well, that looks pretty poor too actually. It's not really that good, and about the only good thing about the exposure is a narrow band of pretty boring sand that looks reasonably well exposed through the central part of the image. Well, I've done this on purpose for this example because we can now fix those two areas of the photo. It's important to turn to manual on the camera. We've been on aperture priority mode, but now let's dial in those settings, f16, ISO 400 and 1/100th of a second. And I can now use a graduated neutral density filter to hold back some of the light from the sky, and this is the image that I get. The image is getting better, and I'm going to use fill-in flash now to light those foreground rocks. Now I'm using ETTL again on the flash. I'm keeping the same camera settings, f16, ISO 400 and 1/100th of a second, and this is the image that I get. And remember that the amount of flash light is worked out by the camera and is determined by the power that's sent to the flash unit. And the effectiveness of a flash is really dependent on the distance of the flash to the subject, and some flash guns may only have very small ranges of distance that they can cover to illuminate the subject. Now, just as we looked earlier on at exposure bias on the image, we looked at +1 and -1 exposure values. You can also do that with your flash gun to have flash exposure compensation. Now on the Canon system you can just simply dial this in the FEC into the camera, and the camera will work out the flashlight that's required using ETTL as we've just talked about, and then it applies this flash exposure compensation before firing the main flashlight as part of the exposure. Now in these next two images you'll see we've used a flash exposure compensation of +1 stop, that kind of looks overexposed, and a -1 stop, and you'll see that the foreground lighting on the rocks will then vary because that's part of the exposure that's made and the lighting that's made with the flash unit, but the background natural light, the ambient light, will remain constant in those two images. There we go then. So you've had two examples where if you just think about how you control the light, how it can dramatically improve your images. I'm Steve Hermitage, thanks very much for watching.